Well, I think our expectation should be that we're going to have multiple vaccine candidates heading into the fall, clearing phase 1, phase 2 safety trials, ready for phase 3 trials. And we'll probably have millions of doses available for those clinical trials, and maybe low tens of millions of doses if, in fact, you have multiple manufacturers. But I think having more than 10 million or so doses between several manufacturers is aggressive. But I think we're going to have enough vaccine that we can run large-scale trials. And in the event of outbreaks in cities, use those vaccines both therapeutically and experimentally, where we deploy them into those cities to try to ring-fence the outbreaks, but also collect information on whether or not the vaccines are working, and what we call a clustered randomization, where what you would effectively do is randomize people in a city to get the vaccine at different intervals to try to determine whether or not it's in fact working and also whether it's safe.
Dr. Gottlieb, do you support early, confident statements like that based on glimpsing, I think, is where there was early data on something like this? I mean, I guess we got that with hydroxychloroquine, and that now seems like it was false confidence. Maybe the opposite was true with remdesivir. But should we be making public comments of confidence like that when we haven't got all the data yet?
Well, look, we've seen data from a number of vaccines now that we know that these vaccine candidates, at least the ones we've seen, are generating immunogenicity. They're generating an antibody response. We need to make sure that they're safe. We need to make sure that response is durable. And then a lot of the complexity is going to be in scaling up the manufacturing in time to have those doses available. So it's aggressive to have hundreds of millions of doses available before the end of the year, because scaling up that manufacturing is a difficult task. And also fraught with a lot of uncertainty. You don't know the kind of yield you're going to get. In 2009, with the H1N1 swine flu pandemic, we got delayed about 2 months in developing a vaccine because when we tried to manufacture that vaccine, the yield was much lower than we expected. And so scaling up the manufacturing was much more complex. Now, I've worked with Moncef for a number of years. I used to be a member of the product investment board at GSK when he was head of R&D. I have a lot of confidence in him and his abilities and his assessments. I just think going into the fall, our base expectation should be that we're going to have a lot of vaccine available to do large-scale phase 3 clinical studies, to turn over the data card on which vaccines are working and which vaccines work the best, and whether or not they're safe. The bar for safety here is going to be very high because these vaccines are going to be used to mass inoculate populations.
Wanted to get you to unpack, Dr. Gottlieb, another troubling news development of the week, and this is the increasing spread of the serious inflammatory condition and syndrome in children related to COVID-19. What do we know at this point, and why did it take so long to discover? Why is it happening so late here?
So CDC came out with a health alert late yesterday associating this condition with COVID-19 for the first time, based on data showing that the people who are getting this, the pediatric patients who are getting this, either have active infection or in many cases have antibodies to COVID-19, which indicates that they have recovered from the virus, but at some point were actively infected. This was first really recognized in late April in the United Kingdom. And now we've seen a lot of cases here in the United States, in New York City in particular, in outbreak settings. And there was a recent report in The Lancet that also identified a cluster of infection in a town in Italy. So this has been something that's been emerging just recently, mostly in Europe and the United States. Interestingly, we didn't see it in Asia. And that's either because it's not getting reported there, or maybe the infection didn't strike as many children in Asia, so there weren't as many at-risk children. Or there might have been other reasons that it wasn't affecting children in this way. But it wasn't something that we observed in the data that we got out of China. It wasn't until the virus got into Europe that we started to observe these cases.
Dr. Gottlieb, the New York Stock Exchange outlined plan this week to reopen in coming weeks, and suggested their focus on testing returning workers would be on temperature checks as opposed to full COVID checks. Well, where do you stand on that? Is a temperature test sufficient, provided the workers are happy with it and sign various forms?
Well, I've had discussions with them. They're doing more than temperature checks. They're also doing symptomatic questionnaires. So they're going to be providing oversight and providing for testing. You know, I really think it depends on the work environment. I think in work environments where you have employees that can't socially isolate at work, so you have at-risk work settings. So think of a shop floor where people are working very closely together in a manufacturing facility. That might be a facility where you want to make testing available on site and maybe do routine testing for the virus. But when you're working in an environment where people can socially isolate at work, they can work in stations where they're not on top of each other, where you're de-densifying the workplace so not everyone's coming back at once, the risk is different. And so I think different businesses are going to have to make different decisions about testing. But I think there's going to be a lot of testing available going into the fall. The platforms for conducting testing are going to be pretty widespread. Any bottleneck to getting testing out to people is going to be the front end, collecting the samples. Where do you go to get tested? Is it available at work? But the actual mechanics, the platforms for running the tests, which is what has been in short supply now, I think we're going to have many more platforms in the market by the fall.
Well, already we're seeing the number of tests go up in the states that have reopened, and that's a good sign. I think the positivity rates are coming down. But what have you seen, Dr. Gottlieb, in terms of hospitalizations and deaths? Is there anything conclusive to draw out of whether these, to answer the question of whether these states opened too early and did it in the right way?
So the national trends are encouraging in terms of we're seeing sustained reductions in new cases, even against a backdrop of increased testing. And the positivity rates, as you said, are going down. 31 states are below 10% of positivity rate. We're seeing hospitalizations trend down nationally, even when you exclude the New York region, which really led us into this epidemic and is now leading us out and comprises such a big portion of the overall cases. But there are states that are still going up. So you look at Arizona and Arkansas, South Dakota, Mississippi, some of the early reopened states, you are seeing an uptick in cases. Now, it's hard to discern a trend there, so it's still early. And many of these states don't report hospitalizations data, so you can't look at that. And also, the hospitalization data is a lagging indicator. Time to hospitalization is about 8 days. And so you're not going to know whether or not you're impacting hospitalizations until probably 2 weeks after you start reopening and having people engage in more activity. That's why I think it's important as states reopen. It's not only when they reopen, but how they reopen. And I think it's important for states to reopen in a staged fashion where they can introduce activity and then start to look at these trends to make sure that they're not measuring an increase in the number of cases.